Hello, public opinion aficionados, and welcome to Rasmussen Reports, where we document the death of federal law enforcement and the U.S. justice system. Now, it's pretty rare that we put out more than one video a day, but something so monumentally profound happened today that we just had to cover it. It's something that may have lasting implications for decades to come when it comes to trust in our federal institutions. You know, those institutions that run so many aspects of our day-to-day lives. It feels like a major turning point in public opinion may be coming in a way even we couldn't predict. And we've seen this self-immolation of credibility coming for years. But what am I talking about? It's this stunning revelation today from a friend of this channel, Julie Kelly, who's been doing the Lord's work, picking apart the revelations from Jack Smith's prosecution of Donald Trump and his document case. Here's basically a high level. The Department of Justice, presumably Merrick Garland, who isn't currently a Supreme Court justice because of Donald Trump, authorized the use of force for FBI agents in the raid of Mar-a-Lago in August of 2022. That is something really stunning. Also, apparently, discussions that were released mention the potential of FBI agents engaging in armed conflict with Donald Trump's Secret Service agents. Not only that, but they even apparently plan for medical resources to be on the scene to treat any possible gunshot victims. And then there's the apparent aspect of their plans to use armed FBI agents to storm the rooms of visitors at Mar-a-Lago just to terrorize them. And finally, for the cherry on top, there's a rumor going around that Ron DeSantis was actually notified hours before the raid and, of course, did nothing. And of course, that's also before he declared his candidacy for president, challenging Donald Trump, you know, the person that was being raided. But what's going to happen with public opinion? It's really hard to say. But what I can say is for the last few years during Joe Biden's presidency, trust in our institutions of law has absolutely imploded. And that's what we're going to cover today. All of our recent interesting polling about the FBI, the DOJ, and Merrick Garland. And as you'll see, and also as we predicted, they show a pretty compelling argument that the rule of law in America has been destroyed by the deep state's desire to take out Trump. Now, there's a lot to cover, and we're going to go at this fast, so please excuse the lack of flashy graphics. And for you number nerds, we're not going to have time to really get into the crosstabs. And also, so there's a starting point. We're going to get into these numbers right here. And this is 2020. Keep in mind, Trump's term was not great for the FBI. There was the whole Clinton email matter. It wasn't an investigation. Then there was a whole thing about Comey leaking and then his firing, and then the whole fact that it got revealed that the FBI was involved in some aspects of setting up Russiagate. So again, not great, but even so, the FBI had a pretty positive favorability rating among all U.S. likely voters. 24% said very favorable, another 36% said somewhat favorable, and that's a combined 60%. And if you've been following our numbers, basically nothing gets 60%. Disney doesn't even get 60%, and Trump's in the low 50s. But that's a relic of the fact that Americans do have pretty strong, favorable impressions of the military and law enforcement. But don't go anywhere, because those numbers are going to get way worse. And again, I know this is going to be small on some people's screens, but you're just going to have to use desktop or pause it. But here they are in roughly chronological order. And this is August 2022, right around the time of the Mar-a-Lago raid. Did the FBI's recent raid on the Florida home of former President Donald Trump make you trust the FBI more or trust the FBI less? 29% of voters said more, but 44% said less. 23% said it made no difference. But what's interesting to note there is that Republicans are often the ones that have a better opinion of law enforcement and military. And here, 70% of Republicans obviously now trust the FBI less. So they're starting to see through this apolitical veneer. Agree or disagree, there is a, quote, group of politicized thugs at the top of the FBI who are using the FBI as Joe Biden's personal Gestapo. That's about as strong as a language you could possibly have in a question, but nonetheless, 53%, a majority of U.S. likely voters, at least somewhat agreed with that statement, and 34% strongly agreed. Only 36% disagreed and only 26% strongly. And believe it or not, a pretty good chunk of Democrats agree with that statement, 37% and 49% of independents. But on to a week later, documents show that White House officials worked with the Department of Justice to facilitate the investigation of former President Trump. How likely is it that this investigation was politically motivated? 46% of voters said very likely, another 14% said somewhat likely. And if you're counting there, that's 60%, a really strong majority. Only 36% of voters said it wasn't likely, and only 19% said not at all likely. But do you agree or disagree with this statement? The Department of Justice has reached an intolerable state of politicization. And again, 57%, a strong majority of voters at least somewhat agreed, and 41% strongly agreed. Only 35% disagreed, only 24% strongly. And it wasn't just Republicans. Although 76% of Republicans agreed, also 39% of Democrats, and a really strong 55% of independents. But let's get to October, after people had had a chance to chew on the raid of Mar-a-Lago for a few months. How important is it that the FBI avoid any appearance of partisan political bias? And 73% of voters said that it was very important. Another 13% said somewhat important, for a combined total of 86%, or essentially everybody. But then this question, agree or disagree? The FBI's credibility is on the line following its inconsistent handling of politically sensitive investigations, failure to hold its own employees accountable for misconduct, and consistent disregard for congressional oversight. Sounds like it's calling the FBI a bunch of loose cannons. But 45% of voters strongly agree with that statement, another 22% somewhat, for a combined total of 67%, or 2 out of 3 voters. And Democrats, 56% of Democrats, a majority, held these opinions about the FBI and its failing credibility. But let's skip ahead to February of 2023. And this one's about the Capitol riot. And the Capitol riot was pretty interesting. People saw a lot of video coming out of that event, and they were horrified, but there wasn't a lot of blame leveled at Donald Trump. 3 weeks after the Capitol riot, Donald Trump left office with an approval rating in the high 40s, which is way better than Joe Biden is doing right now. And of course, people wanted to see that event investigated, but they're pretty mixed about the effectiveness of the Jan 6 commission. And then there's this. How likely is it that undercover agents helped provoke the Capitol riot? 39% of voters said very likely. Another 22% said somewhat likely, for a combined total of 61%. This is the Fedsurrection question. 61% of voters, 6 out of 10, think that the Capitol riot was a Fedsurrection. And again, even a majority of Democrats, 57%, and independents are right there with them. But this was an interesting year for investigations, because not only did Donald Trump have his Mar-a-Lago raid, but then Joe Biden, they found all these documents in his garage and a whole bunch of other offices. And people were pretty upset about the asymmetry of how these investigations were being treated. And that's how you get results like this. March 2023, the FBI has become politically weaponized, starting from the top in Washington. 44% of voters strongly agreed with that statement, and 20% somewhat agreed, for a combined total of 64%. And only 30% of voters disagreed with that statement, only 17% strongly. And only, 41% of Democrats disagreed with that statement. And when it says coming from the top in Washington, we all know what that means. But then in June of 2023, we tested FBI favorability again, and wow, these numbers are way worse. 19% say very favorable, so down a bit, but now only 25% say somewhat favorable, and that adds up to 44%. In the first time in our polling in Joe Biden's presidency, the FBI lost its positive favorability and now is polling closer to Biden than above Trump. That's a really stark change and a just absolute collapse in support. 33% of voters have a very unfavorable rating, and 49%, so that's a plurality, have an at least somewhat unfavorable rating. And the real kicker here, when you look at the party numbers, is check out these Democrat numbers. They have an overall really high favorability rating for the FBI. 72%. When amongst Republicans, it's only 23%, and among independents, it's only 36%. So the Democrats are seeing what the FBI is doing and probably approving of it, which is how you get results like this. Is Christopher Wray a better or worse FBI director than most of those who held the job before him? Only 14% of voters say better, but 33% say worse, and a combined total of 69% say worse or about the same. But again, look at this. 28% of Democrats say better, but only 7% of Republicans. And as we all know, Christopher Wray is a Republican appointee. But how likely is it that top officials at the FBI have helped cover up wrongdoing by Joe Biden or Joe Biden's family members? And we all know what that's talking about. And before I get into the results here, we have a ton of other questions about Joe Biden and Hunter's corruption. And the numbers are absolutely stunning. But back to the results, 48% of voters say very likely. More voters say very likely than the current number of voters who would actually vote for Biden by a long shot. Another 12% say somewhat likely, and that's a combined total of 60% of voters that says the FBI is helping cover up wrongdoings by the Biden family. And only 33%, 1 in 3 voters say it's not likely. Geez, it's only 51% of Democrats who say not likely. And look at the independents. They know what's going on. 57% of independents say likely. But the year progressed a bit, and Donald Trump indictments started to materialize. And we went on War Room back then and predicted that these things would be absolutely horrible for Joe Biden's re-election chances, but they didn't listen and they kept going forward. Former President Donald Trump has been charged with multiple felony counts by the Federal Department of Justice. Is this good for America or bad for America? And again, this is almost a year ago before all of this stuff played out. Only 35% of voters said good and 54% said bad. 36% of Democrats said bad. Only 24% of independents said good. 59% of them said bad. Will the prosecution of Trump make it more likely or less likely that he'll win the 2024 Republican presidential nomination? 34% said more likely, 33% said less likely, so a wash, but a combined total of 60% said more likely or will not make much difference. Only 1 in 3 voters said it would make him less likely to win. And sure enough, May and June of 2023 was when his numbers started going through the roof. Now, there were a lot of other things going on at that time, but it's easy to look back at that period and say that the indictments are really what helped him run away with the nomination. But talking about these prosecutions, quote, "This is an affront to every citizen. We cannot devolve into a banana republic where the party in power uses police force to arrest its political opponents. It's hypocritical for the Department of Justice to selectively prosecute Trump, but not Biden." Again, for these documents. 46% of voters strongly agreed with that statement. Another 12% somewhat agreed. For 58% of the electorate, 58% agreed that this prosecution was a banana republic style abuse of power. And in our recent matchups, Joe Biden only gets 36% of the vote. 9% somewhat disagreed, 25% strongly, for a combined total of 34%, or about 1 in 3 voters. So only 1 in 3 voters disagreed with that statement, and that's horrible. 37% of Democrats agreed. But look at independents. They see what is happening here. 62% of independents agreed with that statement. And that's probably one of the reasons that Donald Trump is winning by double digits among independents. And if that math holds up, it's impossible for Joe Biden to win. Only 35% of the electorate is Democrats. He can't get to 50% without winning almost half of independents. But let's not forget about Merrick Garland. His ratings are horrible too. 18% very favorable, 18% somewhat favorable, combined total of 36%. And that's polling, 6 to 7 points less than where Joe Biden is right now. Really bad, not quite Mitch McConnell bad, but down there. But Merrick Garland, as the Attorney General, is he doing a better job or worse job than most previous Attorney Generals? 24% of voters say better, but 43% say worse. And again, that 43% is more by 7 points than the number of people who would vote for Joe Biden today. Another 23% say about the same. So what have we covered so far? Well, the FBI lost its positive favorability. Merrick Garland is viewed horribly. People think the DOJ and the FBI have been politically weaponized and are selectively prosecuting. That's all really bad. But believe it or not, it gets worse. These affronts to justice are starting to make voters scared. A police state is a tyrannical government that engages in mass surveillance, censorship, ideological indoctrination, and targeting of political opponents. How concerned are you that America is becoming a police state? 46% of voters are very concerned, another 26% somewhat concerned, for a combined total of 72%, more than 7 in 10 Americans. Only 9% are not at all concerned about that. And if you look at the numbers, Democrats are a little less very concerned, but they're pretty overall concerned, 67%. And amongst Republicans, it's a whopping 76%. And independents are polling right there with Democrats and Republicans. This set was about the FBI, though. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? The FBI is a danger to the freedom and security of law-abiding Americans. And a majority, 50% of U.S. likely voters agree with that statement. 28% strongly agree. 45% disagree, and only 26% disagree strongly. Now, here's another one of those Hunter Biden sets, and it's relevant because what is appalling is the juxtaposition of the way that Donald Trump and his prosecutions are being treated versus the way we can all look and laugh at how Hunter Biden is being treated. How likely is it that the Justice Department gave Hunter Biden favorable treatment because of his political connections? 47% say very likely, another 15% say somewhat likely, 62%, 6 in 10 Americans, and only 33%, or 1 in 3, say not likely. And I think you're probably starting to see a pattern emerge. Attorney General Merrick Garland and Justice Department officials interfered with the investigation of Hunter Biden's foreign business deals because they knew scandal would lead right to President Biden. 43% of voters strongly agree with that statement. Another 15% somewhat agree. 58%, 8% somewhat disagree. 26% strongly disagree. And that number there is only 34%. So only 1 in 3 voters disagrees with the fact that Garland and the DOJ waved off because they thought it was going to lead right back to our current sitting president, who also, as our other polling points out, about 50% think he committed high crimes and misdemeanors, which constitute impeachable offenses. Should Congress launch an impeachment investigation of Merrick Garland? 48%, a strong plurality, say yes. Only 35% say no. And it's important to point out that this is back in the fall of 2023. And 32% of Democrats say yes, 69% of Republicans, and also a pretty strong plurality of independents. But when talking about police states, it's important to not leave out the CIA. You know, that same CIA that we recently discovered 42% of US likely voters think was involved in the assassination of JFK. But here's their favorability rating, and it's pretty bad, just like the FBI. 12%, really low, very favorable rating. But, you know, it has a 36% somewhat favorable rating for a combined total of 48%. 39% unfavorable. So it's actually doing better than the FBI. But again, for the first time under Biden's watch, it lost its positive favorability. Do U.S. intel agencies have their own political agenda, or do they generally perform impartially? And again, keep in mind that this is an agency that's only supposed to be involved in overseas stuff. But 49% of voters say they have their own political agenda, and only 36% say they perform impartially. That's a 13-point margin, which is pretty close to the margin that Donald Trump is winning by in our latest 5-way matchup. How likely is it that U.S. intelligence agencies are influencing news media coverage of political issues? So this one's for Mark Dice and all those people that read into Mockingbird media. This is the question that determines whether voters believe that's the case or not. And they say yes. 33% of voters think it's very likely that U.S. intel agencies, and you know, we asked about CIA only 2 questions before now, are involved in media coverage of political issues. Another 31% say somewhat likely, for a combined total of 64%. So the headline is that 64% of voters think it's at least somewhat likely that something like the Mockingbird program is going on. And of course, it's not just Republicans, 79% of Republicans, but a really stunning 61% of independents and even a majority of Democrats, 52%. But to wrap this thread up, how likely is it that the US intel agencies are seeking to control the outcome of the 2024 presidential election? And a majority, 52%, significantly more than the number who would even vote for Donald Trump right now. And he's winning in a matchup. 52% of voters say it's at least somewhat likely, 31% say very likely. Only 38% say not likely, only 20% say not at all. Stunning numbers. It's extremely hard to read through that litany of questions and see those results and not be deeply and fundamentally sad about the state of institutions and of the rule of law in our country. It's almost like we're living in a republic that has fallen. And believe it or not, most voters agree with that statement. We conducted this set just a few weeks ago. The Declaration of Independence says that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed. That means that the people we elect go to DC and do what we tell them to. Does the federal government today have the consent of the governed? 26%, about 1 in 4 voters say yes, but 57% say no. And believe it or not, a majority of every demographic, except Biden approvers, a majority of every demographic except then says no. And this one's even worse. After the Constitutional Congress, someone asked Ben Franklin what kind of government he gave the people. And his response was the epic quote, "A republic if you can keep it." But which is closer to your opinion, that America has done a good job of keeping the republic, or that the republic the founders created has already fallen? Only 39% of voters say that America has done a good job of keeping the republic. But 47%, almost a majority, and a really strong plurality, say that the republic the founders created has already fallen. And it's really easy to see how they came to that conclusion, because keep in mind, these are the same voters that by a majority think that the FBI is Joe Biden's personal Gestapo, that more than 6 in 10 of them think that the FBI has been politically weaponized, starting at the top in DC. And that Banana Republic style political weaponization is happening in the Department of Justice. Like really sick stuff. It seems like people have become increasingly aware of the predicament that we're in just in the last 4 years. But when I hear it talked about, it's often met with cynicism. But I don't think, as a public opinion professional, that cynicism is going to last. It's going to turn into something else. But what and how? Those are the important questions. I don't know the answer to those questions, but here's a really sobering thought to leave you with. More voters now think that a second civil war is likely in the next 5 years, 41%, than would actually vote for Joe Biden in the next election, 36%. If you're scared for the future, please post your thoughts in the comments at YouTube. I'd especially like to see any question ideas where we might get at the failing institutions and what potential black swans we might see in our near future. While you're there, like the video and subscribe if you haven't already, or you could go to Rumble if you don't like YouTube, and follow us on Twitter at Rasmussen_poll. And thanks for watching.